is Farrell. Barritt. Oh, what a line from Barritt. Draw the last man and pass. On to Tuilagi. Inside to Barritt. They've done it. The combo have done it there.
Brad, great to catch up with you over a long distance and in these extraordinary times as you wind down towards the end of your career in the UK. And we're going to finish the chat there, because what I really want to know is where your love of this game was born and where it was nurtured. We know you're a Durban boy and you went to Kearsley College, but when did rugby come on the Barritt radar for the first time?
Likewise, Matthew, lovely to catch up with you too. I'd say the rugby ethos, I guess, within the Barritt household was always pretty strong. I do vividly remember as a 5-year-old boy, I did football at a club called Virginia in sort of Durban North. And one day we sort of driving to football practice and my dad didn't turn into the right sort of lane. I was like, where are we going today? Where are we going? And he just said, oh, no, we're going to rugby today. So he fully made the decision for me that we were going to rugby training instead of football. And I actually started my junior rugby days at Glenwood Old Boys. And more incredibly not, my first club coach was Swayster Brain.
Oh, wow. As
a 6-year-old. So it obviously was nurtured at Durban Prep. They had a sort of great rugby program, you know, the minis where there's 30 kids, like bees around a honey pot running after the ball. And, you know, the rugby was always a huge family driver. My dad played, both grandfathers played, so it was always the mainstay sport within the household.
We've just given some great insight there into just how old Swayster Brain is, but we'll get back to him on that one. And Natal rugby, Sharks rugby, soon after you started playing, was that also part of the family that you would go and support the local provincial side?
Yeah, I think the amazing thing, having grown up, you know, in those late 80s, early 90s, you know, the Sharks were the team at the time. You know, the likes of Gary Teichmann was the captain at the time, you know, perennial Currie Cup champions through the 90s, and going to Kings Park on the weekends was not only a great way to see some great rugby, but was your mechanism for socializing. And even in my latter years, having gone to Kearsley College, it was kind of the thing to do on a Saturday night. So some hugely fond memories at Kings Park, both as a spectator and then fantastically enough to be able to play there in my early sort of teens was equally special.
Yeah, and I guess while the parents were there with the boot open on the outer fields, you got to play at Kings Park at a very young age while you waited for them to take you home.
Yeah, luckily at that point I'd only just got my driver's license, so I was one better than Beast because he was on his bicycle. So luckily I was one of the few to get a driving license really early on.
2006, Brad, you played both Currie Cup and Super Rugby and South African under-21s. It was...
Yeah, it was a special year. I think looking back now, you know, sport's ultimately about timing. And what was fantastic was at that time, there'd been a bit of a turnover at the Sharks. A few players had gone abroad. Dick Muir had taken over as head coach and put a huge emphasis of using players within the system. I was luckily enough to be one of those guys, you know, J.P. Peterson, Waylon Murray, Frans Dane, Alistair Hargreaves, who were all of a similar age and vintage and all got an opportunity very early on. And, you know, hugely grateful for that opportunity from Dick and the Sharks. And, you know, some of those years, especially the 2007 year, is one of the most enjoyable years I've had in rugby. And it's only in the latter years that I've been able to reflect on it. There was probably 3 or 4 years of nightmares about the 2007 final, but I think you learn, having been on the right scoreboard a few times in a final, that sometimes it doesn't have to be the trophy lifting at the end of the day to be able to enjoy the season. And that season of the Sharks was truly special. It was a great mix of experience, of youth. You know, I think back to, you know, the likes of having Butch James and John Smith and AJ Fenter, BJ Burta, Johan Ackerman, Percy Montgomery, Ruan Pienaar, you know, guys who were at the peak of their careers, coming through as a young guy. They were hugely influential on me as a young player and made me feel part of the team from minute one.
Brad, you mentioned Butch James, and just looking back at your career, it was interesting to note that when Butch spent a little bit of time out injured, you spent a bit of time playing in the number 10 jersey. And that was pre the arrival of Frans Steyn at the Sharks. And when Butch was back and France was there, you really got time to settle and make that inside centre position your own.
Yeah, I guess Dick wanted to play a certain style, and that was to run the ball from everywhere. And at that point in time, there was a sort of Sharks brand. So the emphasis was when, Butch was out, that it would give me more opportunity to learn at 10, whilst I honed my skills as a, more of a specialist inside centre. It's something I really enjoyed, but it probably made me a better player in the years after that, understanding a little bit more what a 10 wants from his 12. So it was a great learning curve, but obviously was really grateful to have had that opportunity, because I do think it gave me another string to my bow, having played 12 in the latter years.
And you did mention the 2007 final. I'm sorry to perhaps relive the nightmare that you described once more, but it was an incredible time for South African rugby. I mean, you spoke about the strength of that Sharks team, and no coincidence that the core of that Springbok team that went on to win the World Cup that year was made up largely of players from those two franchises who contested the final.
Yeah, it was I'd say a golden era in South African rugby, because not only did you have the Sharks and Bulls in the final, the Stormers were a fantastic team. The Lions would beat anyone on their day. And, the Cheetahs, I think, were the Currie Cup champs. So it just showed the plethora of talent that was probably before, the exodus towards European rugby sort of happened. And I think, obviously, South African rugby, I look back to some of those pictures from Kings Park, and, what a special day to sell out Kings Park. I think 3 or 4 rounds in the round robin stages, but in a semi-final against the Blues, and ultimately in the final. Some incredible memories of that year, and just sadly we didn't have the icing on the cake.
Another significant moment in your career in that year, Brad, the IRB Nations Cup. You played for the South African emerging side. So now you've played for the South African under-21 side the year before. You're now selected to play for the South African emerging side. At that point, as you reflect on this wonderful career that you've had, what were you honestly thinking then about international rugby? Were you thinking, I can play for South Africa, I want to play for South Africa at the highest possible level?
Yeah, it's probably, to rewind the story maybe 3 or 4 years. When I was at school at Kearsley College, I was sort of recruited by Bath. And I actually spent a 2-3 week camp with the England under-19s in the latter stages of 2004. And I was at the point where, my family, my mom's side were all English. I was quite academic. I wanted to do a tertiary education in the UK, and I thought, playing rugby at the same time. I was probably not aware for coming to the UK and spending 2 weeks in the snow training outside. And I guess what happened at that point, it delayed what was to come in the years later. And around sort of 2007, I don't know, I just got the feeling that there was going to be a good opportunity for me to go abroad. And it largely came from various avenues, both from experiencing rugby, being able to pursue my academic dreams in the UK, but then also from a lifestyle perspective. When do you get the opportunity at 20 years old to travel to London, explore the world, do the thing you love, and hopefully set yourself up for life after rugby? So, looking back, I was probably quite nonchalant about the decision at the time. But, to maybe everyone else, it seemed like a huge call. But sometimes in life, you make these decisions, and the result is what you make of it. If you constantly look back, look over your shoulder and wonder why, and second guess yourself, you don't take the opportunity for what it is. And thankfully, I never did that. I never looked back over my shoulder. I never second guessed myself. And, I'm proud to still be at the same club 12 years later.
Mm. So you went to Saracens after a Currie Cup win in
Yes.
2008. So let's talk about that, because there are some very big names in South African rugby who would gladly say that if they could have achieved one more thing in their careers, we're talking decorated Springboks here, that haven't won a Currie Cup. How special was that for you before you went off to England?
Yeah, I think especially for that team, because what happened at the end of 2008, there was a few guys who moved on, both from a retirement element, but I think a few guys were going abroad too. And whilst it won't make up for 2007, there was some sort of vindication that that group were able to achieve something tangible together. I think in the latter years, I've understood how important and how memorable that occasion was. But, when you're a 19, 20-year-old, you don't really appreciate those moments. And now that I look back, again, another very, very special memory.
And so you went to Saracens after that Currie Cup win. You spoke earlier about how you'd spent a bit of time with Bath. So if you don't mind me asking, why Saracens? Was it, did you have options, or what drew you to Saracens, having had a previous experience with Bath?
Yeah, at that time, I came over maybe 6 months previous. I did visit a few clubs. I think the overwhelming thing that drew me to Saracens was that I had family in London. Close cousins of mine's, aunts and uncle, were all in the greater London area. So there was that element of familiarity, having spent a bit more time there. And oddly enough, I did own a Saracens jersey in around 96, 97. I think my dad had come to the UK at a similar time to when Francois had signed at Saracens. So there was something that drew me to it, and I knew they had some level of South African connection. And, ultimately, I think Eddie Jones was the coach at the time. He came to see me in Durban and sort of made the decision to come to Saracens.
He was still very young then, Brad, but had achieved a lot at senior level rugby in South Africa with the Sharks. But knowing you, probably still very much admitting that you had a lot to learn. I mean, what do you think you immediately learned about yourself and about the game by making that move?
Yeah, a huge amount, I think, both on the field and off the field, probably off the field even more. On the field, slightly different tempo to the game, a greater emphasis on technicalities as opposed to a super rugby style, which is a bit more free-flowing. Physically, I would say week to week, probably slightly more physical, but the pace of the game was definitely slower than I was used to. But the emphasis at the collisions, at the breakdown, not being part of the set piece, but observing the set piece, you could see the amount of detail and structure that went into that. So learning probably the flow of a rugby game and how to manage a game, that was something I definitely developed in the UK. I think off the field, I grew immeasurably off the field. I had lived quite a cocooned life, grown up in Durban, stayed in Durban, played for the Sharks, had always had that familiarity of family and close friends, where now I was very much out in the open. Had to build my own network, had to make new friends, had to start the whole process all over again. And as a young South African, I came from home. The year I'd spent out in rugby, I'd lived with my brother. So everything from paying council tax to registering for insurance to things like that, doing washing, I think it was a completely new and foreign aspect for me. But I think what I've learned now is that it definitely allowed me to stand up on my own 2 feet.
And for you in your position specifically, I mean, you spoke earlier about Dick Muir, who played in the same position as you did and had a very perhaps different philosophy to the game. Were there things that you had to immediately tighten up and alter about the way you played? Yeah,
because I guess initially when I came to Saracens, I think that was only a 2-3 month of, Eddie was here at the time, and maybe he'd had a mantra quite similar to maybe a super rugby mantra, where the season after, Brendan Venter, Mark McCaw had a very different philosophy. Brendan wanted to rebuild the team, and it started with a very, very tightly run defence, a kicking game. And in the latter years, obviously, Mark has been instrumental in making Saracens the attacking force it became. So there was an element of learning from the ground up all over again. And, I think in terms of work rate, I found a new edge in terms of how hard you can push yourself.
Defensively, were the challenges much greater, did you find?
I think the challenges have got more and more defensively as teams have become more organised. And I think similarly, attacking-wise, it's become that much more harder to attack whilst teams have taken on a bit more of a defensive structure. I was looking back at videos of 2007, and fundamentally the whole world used to run a drift defence. And I think literally the year after that with Brendan in 2009, I know Wasps had used it similarly. It came with a blitz defence. It came with more of an offensive style of defence. So, being passive in defence was no longer good enough. It was now about how quickly you can get the ball back. So that was something that changed dramatically in the Premiership, and I don't see changing in the short term.
And it's clear that you made an impression quite quickly in the UK, Brad. You'd spoken about your UK heritage, but 2009, you were invited to come and play for the England Saracens, which was a clear indication that you were on the radar for higher honours.
Yeah, obviously what unfolded there was a great opportunity. I think in my mind I'd made the decision I'm coming to UK, not in the short term, in the medium and long term, and it was a path that I was willing to explore. Subsequently, my full international cap was probably delayed a few years. I was picked in the 2011 autumn squad, but at that point I wasn't in the first test match, and I was led to believe I was going to be playing in the second test match. But at that point, the 23 needs to be kept in, and I think the 7 or 8 other guys in the squad were allowed to play for their clubs. And I played for Saracens that weekend and dislocated my middle finger. So unfortunately, it stood me down for about 6 to 8 weeks. So that was quite a bitter pill to swallow, because I'd had a great run of form. Saracens had been flying for the past 2 seasons, and it had been quite hard to break into that England squad because there were a lot of very established players, guys who played in the England squad for 7, 8 years. So it was a sad opportunity not to take, but was luckily to go on the Saracens tour, I think, in 2010, and managed to get called up to the tour of Australia and played a non-cap game against the New Zealand Maoris for England. And, having been through all those stepping stones, by the time the full cap came in 2012, I knew I was truly ready. And maybe it was a good time to get your first cap, because whilst you're always going to have nerves, I did feel like I had progressed my way and the stepping stones had all been taken.
And you'd experienced that disappointment of feeling on the cusp of making a debut and picking up that injury, but you didn't have to wait too long, because in the following year's Six Nations Championship, you started all 5 games. Debut against Scotland. Just first of all, your recollections of that day and earning your first full cap.
Yeah, really memorable. It was fantastic. Got to have my whole family there. My wife, parents, brother, sister, all flew over to Scotland for the game, and they did say they were at the cruising altitude of a Boeing, could hardly see me, but I knew they were there. I remember it being bitterly cold. It was a traditional Six Nations game, England, Scotland away. Very narrow victory, great celebration. Got to hold the, what is it called, Calcutta Cup, which I believe is the oldest running rugby trophy in the game. So really special memory. I guess which was disappointing was that team that year could quite easily have won the Grand Slam. We lost to Wales at home, I think in the 78th minute against the run of play. A ball was ripped off one of the players midfield, and they put a grubber through and scored and sort of stole it away from us. But for that young team, I think had a combined caps of maybe just around 100 caps in a very new team. To beat Scotland, to beat France away, beat Ireland at home, beat Italy, it was a good way to start your England career.
And there was obviously a lot of faith placed by the coaching staff in that group. You know, you were given time, you were given a series of matches, you in particular, to establish yourself. And I'm interested to know how you felt mentally about it. Did you instantly feel, I belong here, from a mental perspective?
I think the nature of international rugby is never such that you belong. I think it's always got to be a high pressure environment, because such is the nature of playing at the top level. But I definitely knew I belonged, I was good enough, and it's very much up to yourself to make your own destiny. There's swings in careers. It's sometimes about the resilience you can have as a person, as opposed to the talent, I think. You're going to have setbacks in your career and in life. It's the way you can respond to them and rise up against them, and not allow the naysayers to pull you down.
So off the back of that successful Six Nations, you said it yourself, you missed out on a Grand Slam by the narrowest of margins. And then you picked to tour South Africa. So go on and tell us, honestly, how weird was the first test against the Springboks in Durban in 2012?
I remember I had to do a presentation to the England team and telling them sort of what to expect. And it's the first time I had to think about it in complete reversal. I remember actually one of the more vivid memories was being in the opposing change room at Kings Park, and it was something quite unique to me. I don't think I'd even ventured there, let alone been sat there. So again, it all seems a bit surreal now. Unfortunately, I think very early on, before the end of the first half, I had my eye poked out, which turned out to be a lot worse than I probably thought at the time. And it probably summed up the whole experience. It just was really, really surreal to go back to your hometown, to play against the Springboks for England. I remember driving in the ambulance. We initially went to Mshlonga Hospital. There was no eye specialist there. Then I think we drove to Westfall Hospital. There was no ophthalmologist then. And then very, very kindly, I think, a doctor in Durban somehow got hold of the England team and saw what happened, and managed to see me that evening at St. Augustine's. And I think what transpired there, I had a lacerated eyeball, which I was led to believe was 1 millimeter away from my retina, which could have been potentially very, very dangerous. So I can tell the story now because there's no long-term damage, but it was quite a scary moment because I lost all eyesight for a good 3 or 4 days. The whole eye was bloodshot, very, very uncomfortable.
Did you feel like a target, Brad, that day? Did it come across that way?
Well, ironically, the injury happened from my own teammate, Owen Farrell. It wasn't from one of the South Africans. It was both of us going into a tackle, and the arm being swung around the opposite side of the body just happened to go straight into my eye. I don't recall too much. I mean, I would be stupid to think I wouldn't have been a target, but having not been able to play most of the game, I probably only really remember that moment from the whole experience.
And there was a Saracens teammate by the name of Maurits Botha,
yes,
who played in that game as well.
Yeah, so there were 2 ex-South Africans in that game. It was a really memorable tour. Sadly, I missed out on the second test, and I managed to get onto the bench for the third test. But yeah, it probably was a good learning curve for that young England team. There was quite high confidence coming over to South Africa, but you probably learned what a tough challenge it is to beat the Springboks in South Africa. And
that third test was drawn in Port Elizabeth. In that wonderful stadium which had been built for the 2010 FIFA World Cup. Was a special memory?
It was. I mean, because I very sadly missed the whole Football World Cup experience. I was touring over in the States, and I remember watching it, and my wife being there at the time, and anyone who'd been a part of it says it was an incredible moment for South Africa, for the whole country, and a time of true unity. So I was very sad to miss that whole experience, but being able to play at that stadium in Port Elizabeth was a nice second.
Brad, 2 test tries, and both of them memorable. The first one came against New Zealand in a rare victory against the All Blacks at Twickenham.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that game in particular, one of my highlights, a really special victory. I think many would say one of the strongest New Zealand teams of all time. I think they were riding 18-0 up until that point. It was their last game of their tour, and we'd had quite a disappointing autumn series. I know we played Fiji in the first game, played pretty well, won quite convincingly. The week after, lost very narrowly to the Wallabies. The week after, we'd lost to the Springboks by, I think, 5 points. So going into a final game against New Zealand, you thought, if we go a 25% win rate in this series, it's a dismal failure. But there was an underlying confidence with the team. The team felt we were in a good position to put in a performance. And I think that day got as complete an England performance as we've seen for many years. And I think we were 15-0 up at half-time. We put a lot of pressure on. The All Blacks, being the All Blacks, came back very quickly in the second half, scored 2 quick tries, and we were sort of facing down the barrel of a 1-point lead. And had a great moment there. Got an outside break, managed to get the ball out to Manu, who popped it back inside and scored my first test try, which just gave us the impetus to strike back in quick succession and take the game away from them.
Here's Farrell. Barritt. Oh, what a line! From Barritt. Draw the last man and pass. On to Tuilagi. Inside to Barritt. They've done it. The Combo have done it there. Would you believe it? What a moment for those two.
How special was Twickenham for you?
Yeah, I remember that day of all days. The stadium was in a state of euphoria. The noise, the electricity, the atmosphere. I think when Twickenham's at its best, it's when England's winning, because that means the whole crowd is going wild. I'd had various experiences at Twickenham, I guess, with Saracens, and ultimately when you're playing in a club game in a premiership final, so to speak, it's often 50-50 and often sometimes swayed towards the other team. So you never really get that huge electricity. But with an England victory at Twickenham, let's call it 85-90% of the stadium supporting England. That day was possibly my most memorable in an England shirt.
The other try also came at Twickenham against South Africa, but this time in a losing cause.
Yeah, that try was memorable, but I guess when you're on the losing side, you would sacrifice any try for a victory.
Still an opportunity here for England. It's Barritt. Brad Barritt in for his second test try with a minute and some change.